If you have ever felt surrounded by invisible forces, fighting battles that no one else sees, know that there is a heavenly warrior who fights for you. In the midst of spiritual darkness, when hope seems distant and fear approaches, Michael, the Archangel of God, stands up with his flaming sword, ready to defend the children of the Most High. Have you ever wondered who is there for you in your darkest hours? Who intercedes for you when all seems lost? Michael is not just a name in Scripture. He is the Prince of the heavenly armies, the one who confronted Satan himself and cast him down from heaven, as described in Revelation 12:7-9. In this video, you will discover the true story of Archangel Michael, the most powerful among the angels, and understand why he is considered the defender of God's people, the guardian of souls, and the leader in the battle against evil. By watching until the end, you will feel the divine presence strengthening your faith and renewing your courage. Don't look away. Stay with us and allow Michael's light to illuminate your path. For a long time, the maps of the Christian faith were marked by silence. Places mentioned in the scriptures as fundamental as Jerusalem or Capernaum simply disappeared from the historical landscape, swallowed up by wars, floods, legends, and disputes. And among these forgotten names, one always stood out for its almost painful absence: Bethsaida. The hometown of three of the apostles closest to Jesus, the scene of miracles and harsh words, disappeared without a clear trace. Where could this place be that, according to the Gospels, witnessed healings, multiplications, and also one of the most enigmatic trials of Christ? For centuries, the answer seemed to slip through the fingers of scholars like sand. Archaeology tried to answer, but the clues were always fragmentary, imprecise, or contradictory, until something happened. An excavation on the shores of the Sea of Galilee revealed an inscription buried more than a millennium ago, and with it, a new piece entered the chessboard. It was not just ruins. It was a message, written in Greek, protected by time, intact as if it had been shaped for this exact moment in history. On it, a name: Peter. Not just the disciple, not just the apostle, the chief of the apostles, the bearer of the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Why would a church from the Byzantine period, built some 15 centuries ago, state this so clearly? How did this title end up engraved on the floor of a temple so explicitly, so deliberately? And what does this tell us about the earliest memories of the Christian faith? These are questions that are no longer restricted to the walls of theology or universities. Now, they rest in stone, in full view of everyone. The curious thing is that this discovery did not begin with a grand quest, sponsored by empires or led by academic celebrities. It was the result of persistent, meticulous work, often ignored by the mainstream media. A group of archaeologists decided to explore a previously little appreciated area known as El Araj. What they found there reconfigures not only biblical geography, but also the basis of the debate about spiritual authority in the origins of Christianity. Few realize the importance of a city like Bethsaida within the New Testament. It is mentioned as the home of Peter, Andrew, and Philip. Miracles took place there, such as the healing of a blind man and the multiplication of the loaves. But it was also the site of one of Jesus' most stern warnings, comparing it to pagan cities that would have repented if they had witnessed the same works. After this episode, Bethsaida disappears from the biblical pages, and as the centuries passed, its whereabouts became a mystery that intrigued pilgrims, scholars, and religious people. Attempts to locate Bethsaida have yielded different hypotheses. One of them pointed to Et Tel, located some distance from the sea, which raised doubts about the logic of considering a fishing village so far from the water. Another possibility was El Araj, closer to the coast, but until then, without conclusive proof. This began to change when layers of earth were removed, revealing architectural structures, fragments of everyday objects, and finally, a basilica with preserved mosaics. It is at this point that the story gains depth. What once seemed to be just an archaeological dig takes on profound theological and historical contours. The ground reveals a hidden narrative, a kind of petrified liturgy that has traversed time to reappear precisely in an era marked by doubts, revisions, and skepticism. The inscription in the Basilica of El Araj is not just an archaeological curiosity, it is a testimony. And like all ancient testimony, it carries more than information. It brings interpretations, legacies, and perhaps even a direct provocation to our contemporary way of dealing with the sacred. The fragments discovered so far indicate that this church was built with purpose, on a site that Christians of the time considered sacred not only by tradition, but by memory. They had no satellites, no geological scanners, no carbon sensors. They had stories passed down, places remembered. Debates among archaeologists and theological reflections. After all, the absence of a city is not just a problem of location. It is an absence that makes it difficult to physically connect with the sacred text. The first systematic effort to locate Bethsaida began in the 19th century. European researchers, especially Germans and Americans, began exploring the area around the Sea of Galilee using methods that were more akin to what we now consider modern archaeology. One of the first sites proposed was Et Tel, an ancient mound located about 2 kilometers from the present shore of the sea. In an era before the area was urbanized, this kind of distance might have seemed acceptable. But closer examination began to raise doubts. Et Tel showed signs of ancient occupation, but its most significant remains date back to the Old Testament period. Clear evidence of a significant settlement at the time of Jesus was lacking. Furthermore, the logic of a fishing town being so far from the water was difficult to support. Although the level of the Sea of Galilee varied over time, geological studies indicate that the difference would not explain such a marked distance from the coast. Nevertheless, for lack of a better alternative, Et Tel remained the prevailing hypothesis for several decades. It was not until the late 20th century that a new point of interest began to gain prominence. El Araj, a low-lying, marshy area near the northeastern shore of the sea, began to be seriously re-evaluated. Small excavations there revealed fragments of pottery and some signs of a Roman presence. But it was not until the year 2016 that the site received a full archaeological investigation, led by teams coordinated by Israeli and American institutions, including the University of Nebraska at Omaha. The results began to significantly alter the debate. In the first few years of excavation, coins, tools, remains of structures and pavements emerged that indicated continuous occupation since the 1st century. This was exactly what was missing at Et Tel. El Araj's location also made more economic and cultural sense. A fishing community would naturally develop near the shore, with easy access to the water. The area's identification with the Jordan River Delta, which flows into the Sea of Galilee, also reinforced the site's strategic and commercial value. Another factor that began to weigh in favor of El Araj was its consistency with ancient accounts of Christian pilgrims from the Middle Ages. Specifically, the account of the 8th century Bishop Willibald, who described visiting a church dedicated to Peter and Andrew in the region of Bethsaida. Although this testimony was long treated with skepticism by modern historians, the discovery of the basilica at El Araj centuries later shed new light on this account. What was considered devotional tradition began to be revised as possible eyewitness testimony. The geographical enigma of Bethsaida was never just about land, coordinates, or maps. It was also a search for coherence between the biblical text, Christian tradition, and the remains of the past. Archaeology, in this sense, acts not only as a science of excavation, but as a mediator between the visible and the forgotten. The lost city gradually began to reveal itself not as a simple dot on the map, but as a key to understanding an entire network of historical and spiritual meanings. It is important to note that, even with all this emerging evidence, definitive identification of El Araj as Bethsaida still faces challenges. Archaeological research is a process that requires time, review, and consensus. However, the data obtained so far form a cohesive and impressive set. The material remains match the profile of a 1st century fishing village. The geographic location is consistent with the biblical account, and the religious elements discovered at the site point to a continuing memory of the presence of central figures of the Christian faith. This process of reuniting memory and territory puts into perspective not only the existence of Bethsaida, but also the way cultures preserve what they consider sacred. For centuries, even without modern technology, communities have kept alive the memory of where Peter lived, where Andrew walked, where Philip announced. These memories have withstood the test of time and in some way have waited to be rediscovered. The soil that is now being excavated by archaeologists may have been chosen long ago by silent voices that never stopped believing that something divine had happened there. As the debate over the location of Bethsaida intensified, El Araj gained increasing attention from the scientific community. But the decisive change came with the beginning of systematic excavations at the site, conducted from the year 2016 by Israeli archaeologists in partnership with experts from international universities. What began as an investigation of a partially flooded field has revealed, layer by layer, surprising remains that connect the site to a crucial period in Christian history, the 1st century of the Common Era. The great difference between El Araj and other candidates for ancient Bethsaida is precisely the quantity and quality of the evidence that dates back to the time when Jesus carried out his ministry in Galilee. Among the most relevant finds are everyday utensils, such as domestic pottery, amphorae, and fishing tools, as well as Roman coins, all dated to a period that covers the first decades of the 1st century. These objects indicate that this is not just a late occupied area, but rather an active settlement during the period described in the Gospels. One of the key concepts in archaeology is what is known as stratigraphy, which refers to the analysis of soil layers accumulated over time. At El Araj, archaeologists have identified a clear sequence of occupation, with upper layers corresponding to the Byzantine period and below them levels dating directly back to the Roman era. This vertical reading of the soil allows a reliable chronology to be established, showing that the site was inhabited continuously over many centuries. This reinforces the possibility that what was built there later originated from an already existing tradition, passed down from generation to generation. Another crucial element in the excavations is the set of architectural structures discovered. In addition to the Byzantine church, which would stand out in its own right, remains of buildings typical of villages from the Roman era were found, such as stone walls without mortar, dirt floors, foundations of small houses, and rudimentary drainage channels. These details, as simple as they may seem, are clear indications of an organized, albeit modest, community with characteristics compatible with a fishing village, as described in the Gospels. This is not a monumental city with marble columns or large temples. On the contrary, the evidence points to a functional residential nucleus focused on subsistence and fishing, exactly the kind of place where it would be natural to find people like Peter, Andrew, and Philip. Life in Bethsaida, according to what the soil of El Araj is revealing, was practical, centered on production and daily life. And it is this simplicity that strengthens the plausibility that the roots of three of Jesus's closest followers were in fact there. The geographical context also favors El Araj. Situated in a low, marshy area near where the Jordan River flows into the Sea of Galilee, the site has ideal conditions for the type of economy described in the Gospels. The proximity of water facilitated fishing, transportation, and trade with other regions of Galilee. In addition, the natural fertility of the land, enriched by sediments carried by the river, made the area attractive for subsistence farming. These factors explain why a community would have settled there and managed to sustain itself over time. The finds do not stop at the utensils and structures. One of the most significant moments of the excavations was the identification of a Roman bath, partially preserved. Public baths were common in urban centers of the Roman Empire, but their appearance in villages indicates a certain degree of local importance. This discovery suggests that El Araj was not just an isolated rural outpost, but possibly a regional meeting point with a certain flow of visitors or even pilgrims. It is worth noting that the excavations are overseen by experts in various fields, including numismatics, ceremology, and analysis of organic materials. This multidisciplinary work ensures that the interpretations made based on the objects found are not merely speculative, but rather based on rigorous technical methods. The glass fragments, for example, were associated with containers used to store perfumes and oils, items that indicate the presence of cultural and religious practices, and perhaps even some form of daily ritualization. Another important piece of information is the significant number of coins discovered at the site. They not only help to date the layers of occupation, but also reveal commercial connections with other parts of the empire. Some coins were minted in Tyre and Caesarea Maritima, the arrangement of the side aisles and the delimitation of the altar space reveal a building built with precision and intention. Its size, proportionally significant for the region, indicates that it was not just any temple, but a sanctuary possibly intended for pilgrims. The use of local basalt in the foundations and ornamental mosaics on the floor indicate a significant effort of investment and dedication on the part of the community that built it. Among the most notable elements is the mosaic flooring system that covers a large part of the interior. The geometric designs, the arrangement of colors, and the care taken in the elaboration of the figures are typical of churches built in regions under Eastern Christian influence. More than just ornamentation, the mosaics fulfill a symbolic function. They convey reverence for the sacred space and communicate through art, theological messages, tributes, and requests for intercession. This type of visual ornamentation was common in Byzantine basilicas, especially those located in areas considered to be sites of Christian memory. The use of tesserae, small pieces of colored stone carefully grouped together to form inscriptions and designs, represents not only the technique, but also the desire to make a message permanent. And it is at this point that the Temple of El-Araj takes on a dimension that goes beyond architecture. Amidst the fragments of the building, an inscription preserved almost intact was revealed, containing words in Greek that refer directly to the figure of Peter. The inscription explicitly cites Peter's name with the titles of Chief of the Apostles and Holder of the Keys of the Heavenly Kingdom. This is not a decorative reference or a vague expression of devotion. The words are clear, firm, placed in the center of the pavement, as if they were the heart of the temple. The choice of terms itself reflects the liturgical tradition of the time and a theology structured around Peter's authority. What many treated as a doctrine developed later in Rome appears here reaffirmed by Christians from the Eastern region, centuries before the split between the Western and Eastern churches. The context in which this church was built also helps us understand its importance. Between the 4th and 7th centuries, the region of Galilee underwent a significant religious transformation. With the officialization of Christianity as the religion of the Roman Empire, there was an intense effort to map and preserve places considered holy. Churches began to be built in places associated with the life of Jesus and the apostles. And in this scenario, building a basilica in El-Araj with an explicit dedication to Peter does not seem like an isolated gesture, but rather part of a broader strategy of sacralizing the biblical landscape. The construction of temples on sites associated with New Testament figures followed its own logic. It was based not only on written records, but also on oral traditions, local testimonies, and the continuity of the Christian presence. The temple discovered in El-Araj confirms this pattern. Its construction on the remains of a first-century settlement suggests that there was a living memory of the place there. It was not a matter of choosing just any spot to build a church, but of identifying a space that was already considered sacred because of its history and its connection with the followers of Jesus. In addition to the main inscription, fragments of other dedications and Christian symbols were found nearby. Stylized crosses, floral elements associated with the resurrection, and incomplete inscriptions still under analysis reinforce the religious character of the site. These findings contribute to the understanding of how ancient communities recorded their faith not only in words, but also in visual forms that resisted time, climate, and even oblivion. The preservation of the temple was no accident. What we see today is the result of gradual burial caused by successive floods in the Jordan Plain, which unknowingly protected the site. For more than 14 centuries, the church remained hidden, isolated from the surface, until recent excavations brought back its shapes, colors, and messages. It is as if time had sealed that memory, waiting to be found again at the right moment, when eyes were ready to decipher its meaning. At the heart of the temple revealed at El-Araj, beneath the feet of those who walked there centuries ago, lay an inscription carefully inlaid into the mosaic floor. What could have gone unnoticed as simple decoration turned out, when translated, to be a theological testimony loaded with meaning. Written in Greek, the lingua franca of the Eastern Christian faith in the first centuries, The message not only mentions Peter, but attributes to him titles that go beyond common reverence. He is named as Chief of the Apostles and Bearer of the Keys of the Kingdom of Heaven, expressions that directly echo the passage from the Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 16. These words were not placed randomly. They were placed in the liturgical center of the temple, within a circle carefully traced with geometric tesserae. The space where this inscription was placed corresponds to the diaconicon, a sector traditionally reserved for activities related to the preparation of the liturgy. The choice of this location gives the message a special weight, indicating that its content was considered worthy of being kept in view, not just as an adornment, but as a confession of faith. The language used is also revealing. Instead of generic terms of veneration, the authors of the inscription used specific titles with precise meanings within the early Christian tradition. By designating Peter as leader among the apostles, the inscription suggests not only respect, but a hierarchy. And by calling him the keeper of the heavenly keys, he evokes the biblical image of spiritual authority conferred directly by Jesus. These titles refer to the idea that Peter had received a distinct mission with powers of connection and liberation, a recurring theme in theological debates over the centuries. It is important to emphasize that this statement does not arise from Rome or from later doctrinal documents. It was shaped by Christians in the Byzantine East, centuries before the division that would separate the Eastern and Western churches. This means that the understanding of Peter's role as a leadership figure was not exclusive to one branch of Christianity, but shared by communities that had not yet separated. The El Araj inscription, therefore, represents more than a devotional tribute. It testifies to a liturgical and doctrinal memory widely recognized in the early church. In the vocabulary used, it is possible to note terms that, even with the passing of time, maintain their symbolic value. The expression that designates Peter as the one who holds the keys refers to an imaginary deeply rooted in the Jewish and Christian tradition. The idea of keys is not only linked to physical access, but to the concept of delegated authority. In the book of the prophet Isaiah, chapter 22, this symbol is applied to the royal house of David, representing dominion entrusted to a faithful servant. When this same symbol appears in the mouth of Jesus when speaking to Peter, it carries the connotation of continuity, government, and responsibility. The choice of Greek as the language also deserves attention. Although Latin became the official language of the Church in the West, it was Greek that predominated in the Christian communities of the East during the first centuries. It was the language of culture, theology, and the first translations of the Scriptures. This reinforces the authenticity and scope of the belief expressed in the inscription. The use of Greek indicates that this message was not addressed to distant clerical elites, but to a community that thought, prayed, and celebrated in that language in a direct and lived way. In addition to the text, the very way in which the inscription was integrated into the temple space reveals aesthetic and spiritual care. The circle that surrounds it, made with mathematical precision, can be interpreted as a symbol of eternity and plenitude. The location in which it is located, close to the center of the floor, ensures visibility and preservation. Everything suggests that this inscription was not just a decorative detail, but an integral part of the worship experience. Those who entered that temple did not just walk on stone. They were invited to remember a fundamental truth of the faith professed there. It is impossible to separate the content of the inscription from its environment. It does not float in isolation like a quotation on parchment. It is anchored in a physical location associated with the memory of the apostles, in a religious structure built on layers of continuous occupation. This convergence of soil, word, and practice gives the inscription a unique density. It is not an object displaced from its context, but a living expression of the belief of a community that chose to preserve, with stone and pigment, what it considered essential. This type of material testimony is rare. Most of the debates about Peter's position throughout history have been held in theological texts, councils, and doctrinal treatises. Finding this It was not only a center of worship, but also a support point for pilgrims, such as Willibald himself. The convergence of text and physical evidence transforms a previously ignored medieval record into a key piece for understanding the continuity of the Christian tradition in the region. More than confirming a geographical fact, this revaluation of Willibald's testimony reveals how Christian communities preserved the memory of sacred places through ritual repetition, orality, and symbolic permanence. During the centuries when archaeology did not yet exist as a science, it was these pilgrims' records that kept alive the location of so many places mentioned in the Gospels. Willibald's journey is particularly significant because it shows how deeply rooted the Christian faith of the first millennium was in biblical geography. His journey through Palestine, Syria, and other territories linked to the life of Jesus reflects a clear desire to physically experience what had been transmitted by tradition. He sought not only to understand, but to touch, see, and inhabit the spaces of the sacred narrative. This brings his experience closer to a sensorial religiosity, where faith becomes almost palpable through contact with the ground, buildings, objects, and names. Over the centuries, confidence in accounts like Willibald's has been weakened by the lack of archaeological support. With the consolidation of modern critical thinking, it has become common to dismiss medieval documents as too devotional or too distant from historical facts. But the excavations at El Araj challenge this logic. By confirming that there was, at that very spot, a church dedicated to Peter and Andrew, with the characteristics described by an 8th century European traveler, archaeology restores credibility to a voice that was previously relegated to the realm of tradition. This reunion between vestige and testimony broadens the way we understand the continuity of Christian memory. It shows that, despite political transformations, cultural changes, and documentary losses, certain memories remained active, passed down from generation to generation. Even without modern dating instruments, local communities knew where to build their temples, what to inscribe on mosaics, and to whom to dedicate their prayers. This fidelity to memory is perhaps one of the strongest legacies of the early Christian tradition. Willibald's importance lies not only in what he saw, but in what his memory has represented over the centuries. His journey was recorded with simplicity, without any pretense of writing official history, but it endured. When everything seemed forgotten, the soil confirmed his words. It is at this intersection of faith, narrative, and evidence that history is reconstructed. And in this process, we realize that tradition is neither static nor merely symbolic. It is dynamic, shaped by voices that have never ceased to point to the places where something sacred happened. The case of El Araj, by recovering Willibald's account as a reliable source, invites the re-evaluation of many other ancient texts that have been neglected over time. Not every written memory should be read as legend. Some of them, even without the intention of convincing through reason, carry within themselves the strength of a lived conviction. And when this conviction finds support in the stones, in the remains, and in the hidden layers of the soil, the distance between the past and the present seems to disappear. It is as if, for a brief moment, the voices that crossed deserts and mountains to preserve the memory of the apostles were still echoing through the rediscovered corridors of that ancient basilica. The rediscovery of the church in El Araj, with its inscription highlighting Peter as the central figure, inevitably leads to one of the most emblematic metaphors of Christianity: the keys of the kingdom of heaven. This image, repeated since the first centuries in sermons, sacred art, and catechesis, has its direct origin in the dialogue between Jesus and Peter, recorded in the Gospel according to Matthew. The symbolic attribution of the keys to the apostle carries a density that goes beyond figurative language. It expresses, in a concentrated form, a profound notion of authority, responsibility, and trust. In the ancient world, especially within the structures of the Middle East, the act of handing over keys had very specific political and spiritual connotations. They represented legitimate access, delegated power, and dominion over a given space. In the Hebrew tradition, there is a clear parallel in the book of the prophet Isaiah, where God declares that he will place on the shoulders of his servant the key of the house of David, so that what he opens, no one will be able to close, and what he closes, no one will be able to open. This language, when taken up by Jesus in speaking to Peter, establishes a direct connection between the messianic promise and the establishment of a new type of spiritual leadership. The inscription at El Araj, in naming Peter with this title, not only reaffirms a devotional belief, but also conveys a consolidated view of the role he played within the Christian community. The apostle was not remembered simply as a disciple or a martyr, but as one who had been given a unique mission. This recognition, engraved in stone by Eastern Christians, indicates that the understanding of Peter as a prominent figure was not limited to the Latin West. It was shared by peoples, churches, and cultures long before any division between Rome and Constantinople. This understanding does not imply contempt for the other apostles, but rather points to a distinct role played by Peter within the group of Christ's followers. In the gospel narratives, he is often placed in a prominent position. He is the first to be called, the one who speaks on behalf of the others, the one who receives questions directly from Jesus. And even in moments of weakness, such as his denial during Christ's arrest, he is restored and reinstated with words that reinforce his mission: to feed the sheep, to care for the flock. The metaphor of the keys, therefore, is not a simple symbolic adornment. It expresses the confidence that the early Christian community saw in Peter a point of reference. This does not automatically translate into a hierarchical institution as would develop in the following centuries, but it does reveal that, from very early on, there was an understanding that he had been chosen to play a leadership role. This distinction is present in patristic texts, in liturgical hymns, and as we now see, also in archaeological inscriptions. Another aspect that reinforces this interpretation is the vocabulary used in the various Christian traditions when referring to Peter. Terms such as protokletos, or Prince of the Apostles, appear in sources from the early church, not only in Latin, but also in Greek and Syriac. This shows that Peter's unique place was recognized in communities spread across different regions of the empire. The message inscribed in the Basilica of El Araj, therefore, is inserted into a broader context, reflecting a shared memory that transcends geographical borders. Although the symbolism of keys has been absorbed over time by ecclesiastical systems and institutional debates, its origin lies in the personal relationship between master and disciple. When Jesus says that he would give Peter the keys of the kingdom, he is giving him a type of authority that is not one of possession, but of service. It is a function that is carried out not in power, but in the mission of guarding, guiding, and above all, opening paths of reconciliation and faith. This understanding sheds light on why 5th century communities decided to build a church dedicated to Peter in a place where he had lived. By inscribing the memory of his spiritual authority on the floor of the temple, they were not just venerating a historical figure. They were reaffirming a link between land, memory, and mission. The temple thus became a concrete sign that the faith transmitted by the apostles was still alive, embodied in specific places and preserved by generations who did not want time to erase what they considered sacred. The significance attributed to Peter by ancient communities cannot be reduced to modern confessional disputes. What emerges from the remains in El Araj is the portrait of a faith that recognized, in the figure of that fisherman turned shepherd, a living reference. Someone who had received a special calling and whose presence, even after death, continued to be honored and remembered as the foundation of Christian hope. This recognition, preserved in the silence of a forgotten inscription, now reappears as confirmation of what the ancients already knew. Peter was more than a witness to the events. He was someone who was entrusted with the task of opening and closing, of guiding and caring, in the name of a higher authority. And by evoking his image with the keys, the community that built that church was not just doing theology. She kept a memory, transmitted in stone, so that no one would forget who received the mission of keeping the door of faith open. As the discoveries at El Araj became public, a new phase began. events. On the other hand, there is a growing number of archaeologists and historians who argue that the body of evidence from El Araj is sufficiently solid to support the identification of the site as the Bethsaida mentioned in the Gospels. The convergence of medieval accounts, Byzantine structures, and 1st century artifacts, they say, forms a coherent chain of evidence. For these researchers, the value of oral tradition and the memory practices of early Christian communities cannot be underestimated. They functioned as a kind of living archaeology, transmitting information from generation to generation, even without scientific instruments. The field of biblical archaeology in general does not work with absolute certainties. Its findings are interpretive in nature, always subject to revision as new techniques and discoveries emerge. For this reason, the validation of a site like El Araj occurs in stages, often over decades. The excavation that is now uncovering traces of the past is still ongoing, and much will still be revealed or confirmed as studies continue. In addition to the technical analysis, the reception of the discovery has also been reflected in interfaith debates. In different Christian communities, especially among Catholic and Orthodox scholars, the find has been seen as an opportunity to revisit themes related to apostolic leadership, the role of Peter, and the importance of sacred geography. Some religious institutions have already shown interest in following the research more closely, and even in financially supporting the next phases of the excavation. The repercussions also reached the press, albeit timidly. Reports in specialized channels, scientific magazines, and archaeology portals covered the case prominently, while broader media outlets still treat the subject with a certain distance. This is due in part to the difficulty of communicating archaeological discoveries without giving in to sensationalism or hasty skepticism. The challenge lies in presenting the findings responsibly, recognizing both their potential and their limits. Despite the caution, one element is undeniable. What was found in El Araj puts back on the agenda a discussion that seemed stagnant. The idea that a village like Bethsaida could actually be located, excavated, and interpreted on the basis of concrete remains reinforces the connection between text, space, and time. It is a reminder that, even after so many centuries, the soil still holds stories waiting to be confirmed. In times when traditions are constantly re-evaluated and historical narratives are placed under new perspectives, what is discovered in El Araj proposes a profound reflection on how we deal with the past. It is not always necessary for stones to speak loudly to be heard. Sometimes, it is enough to listen to them with the care of someone who understands that the truth, when it emerges from silence, does so with the weight of permanence. The rediscovery of the ancient basilica in El Araj, together with the inscription that exalts Peter, does not only have repercussions in academic circles. Its effects go beyond the limits of research and directly affect the spiritual experiences of thousands of people. The concrete possibility of standing on the ground where the apostles walked rekindles feelings of belonging and connection with the roots of the Christian faith. For many believers, the confirmation of places mentioned in the scriptures is not just a historical fact, but a way of seeing the sacred narrative gain shape, color, and geography. This perception reinforces the sacredness of the space. What was once just an archaeological site is transformed, in the eyes of believers and pilgrims, into a link with the time of the Gospels. This reunion between land and tradition awakens reverence, silence, and inner renewal. At the same time, it encourages dialogue between different branches of Christianity. The inscription, written by Eastern Christians long before institutional divisions, reveals a theology shared by communities that are now separated. In this sense, the discovery not only legitimizes a memory, but proposes reconciliation. She recalls that before the doctrinal divisions, there was a common faith, expressed in stone, liturgy, and devotion. By bringing to light a past that predates the disputes, the place invites listening, mutual respect, and recognition of what unites. It is a testimony that, more than dividing opinions, can inspire bridges. After all, when the earth speaks with humility, it remembers that there are foundations that still support what was experienced in communion. When fragments of stone reveal forgotten messages, we are not just faced with ruins. We are faced with choices made centuries ago, of voices that decided to record what they believed to be eternal. The Basilica at El Araj, with its mosaics and inscriptions, is not just an archaeological find. It is a testimony preserved by the silence of time, which now returns to provoke, clarify, and perhaps also restore. In the face of so many fragmented narratives, this discovery invites us to listen attentively. It reminds us that faith, when lived deeply, transcends empires, resistance, and centuries. The communities that built that temple did not act in a hurry or improvise. They built based on memory, with confidence in what had been transmitted. And in doing so, they left clues, not only for scholars, but for all those who still seek to understand where the ground of their own belief begins. In times of ruptures and hasty discourses, the grounds of El Araj offer a pause, an opportunity to consider what remains, what has been forgotten, and what deserves to be rediscovered. Among the fragments of pottery, mosaic drawings, and inscriptions in Greek, perhaps what stands out most is not only the figure of Peter, but the strength of a faith that has withstood the test of time without losing its voice. And in rediscovering this voice, perhaps we will also rediscover part of ourselves. If you enjoyed the content and want to support our work so that we can continue to bring you more in-depth research and analysis, please consider making a donation of any amount. This contribution directly helps in the growth of the channel and in the production of even richer materials. Thank you very much for your support.